You could hear the snickering before the meeting even started. Farmer Joe walked into the HOA clubhouse with mud still drying on his boots and a carton of fresh eggs tucked under his arm. He wasn't dressed like the others. No polo shirt, no gold watch, no smug air of suburban superiority. Just denim overalls, sun-scarred hands, and the kind of calm that made people uncomfortable. The moment he took a seat near the snack table, Caronette, the HOA president with her stiff pearls and stiffer attitude, leaned over to the others and muttered just loud enough, "That man brings chickens to a housing community and thinks eggs make up for it." The board erupted in quiet chuckles. Another member whispered, "I heard his goat tried to eat the mailbox." By the time Caronette banged her little gavel and called the meeting to order, the atmosphere was already thick with disrespect. Joe just sat there quietly, eyes steady, not reacting as the very people who fined him for planting wildflowers mocked his livelihood like it was some kind of carnival act. What they didn't know, what they couldn't even begin to imagine, was that the man in muddy boots once commanded armored brigades across continents. That same man had been quiet not because he was weak, but because he'd seen real conflict, real destruction, and knew better than anyone that power didn't come from a clipboard or a fine. It came from patience and preparation. And while they laughed at his eggs and his goats, they were standing on ground older than their bylaws, in a town where he knew every inch of the land better than they knew the contents of their own HOA rulebook. The meeting was supposedly about neighborhood beautification, which for this HOA meant punishing anything they couldn't categorize as beige, trimmed, or boring. Caronette read off her list of new violations. Someone's grass was 3/8 of an inch too high, one homeowner had dared paint their garage door an unapproved shade of ivory, and Joe, apparently, was being fined for allowing his sunflowers to intimidate smaller plants. She didn't even look at him when she announced it. She just called it a rural intrusion on a modern community. Joe raised his hand. Everyone stiffened. The farmer had never spoken at one of these meetings. Caronette gave a tight smile and said, "Go ahead, Mr. Joseph." He stood, removed his straw hat, and said in a steady voice, "My house, my land, and my barn were here before your HOA ever existed. I don't fall under your rules." The room shifted. A few members looked confused, others irritated. Caronette's smile didn't falter, but her eyes tightened. "Legacy zoning doesn't exempt you from community standards," she replied crisply. Joe nodded once, put his hat back on, and sat down. That was all he said. But the tension that followed lingered like smoke after a small fire. By the end of the meeting, the fines had been approved, the insults had been delivered, and Joe's offering of fresh eggs sat untouched beside a plate of overpriced bagels. As he left the room, someone behind him muttered, "Maybe next time he can bring a pig and do trick." Another laugh. Joe said nothing. But that night, as he sat on his porch overlooking the fields that had been in his family for 3 generations, he wasn't thinking about pigs. He was thinking about how HOA boards like this one only respected 2 things: control and spectacle. And he had both, just not the kind they were ready for. The next day, a formal letter arrived listing the exact fines: $275 for unauthorized livestock, his goats, $120 for unsanctioned crop growth, his tomatoes, and an additional $50 for what they described as non-compliant rural signage, referring to a hand-painted wood sign that said "Welcome to Joe's Farm." Attached was a threat: failure to comply may result in legal action and community-level restrictions. Joe read the letter, poured himself some coffee, and looked out at his barn. There was something under the tarp he hadn't looked at in years. But the time was getting closer. That week, Caronette wasn't done. She'd scheduled an emergency HOA walkthrough of Joe's property. Despite multiple notices that they had no jurisdiction, she arrived with 2 board members and a tape measure, snapping photos and making comments like, "We'll need to bulldoze this if he doesn't comply." Joe watched from the porch. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply walked out with a mason jar of lemonade, sipped it slowly, and said, "You might want to reconsider trespassing. This land's under county protection." Karanet scoffed. We'll see what the city says when they get my report. She turned her back to him and continued snapping pictures. Joe walked away. But inside, something had shifted. Later that evening, while the HOA board typed up reports and mocked Joe's barnyard empire in their group chat, the internet was waking up to something else entirely. A local teenager had uploaded a short video of Karanet walking around Joe's land, rudely pointing and mocking, followed by a clip of one of the goats chasing her back to the road. The audio was clear. This is why we need fences. This place smells like a tractor exploded. The video racked up views quickly. People in town began commenting. Isn't that Joe's place? He gave us free corn during the flood. Didn't he used to be in the military? Respect the man, not the mud. Joe didn't post the video, didn't even know it existed until someone from the local news called asking for an interview. He politely declined. He wasn't in it for the fame. But the fire had been lit. Meanwhile, HOA members began receiving unexpected messages, emails from townsfolk, memes mocking their anti-dirt campaign, even a handmade sign placed outside the clubhouse reading, "Keep your laws off my land." Karanet was livid. She threatened legal action against the teenager who posted the video. When that didn't work, she tried calling a special meeting to ban social media footage of the neighborhood. It backfired spectacularly. Residents began bringing cameras to meetings. Transparency, they said. After all, if they had nothing to hide. One day, Joe visited the town archives. He requested the charter documents for his property, dating back over 70 years. What he found made him smile. Maps, annotations, signatures proving not only was his land excluded from the HOA's original zoning, but it had protections under a Veteran Homestead Act signed by the mayor's own grandfather. It was a legal goldmine. He made copies. He filed a quiet report. And then he went home and peeled back the tarp. Beneath it was steel. Heavy. Rust-kissed. A memory from another life. One the HOA had mocked into awakening. Joe ran his hand across the cold surface and whispered, "Let's give them a real reason to complain." The ground beneath him rumbled with more than just memory, it rumbled with promise. And for the first time in years, Joe smiled a very different kind of smile. The kind of smile that said, "You wanted a show? I'll give you a war." By the time Monday rolled around, Joe's mailbox was stuffed with more HOA notices than actual mail. Each letter seemed more absurd than the last. One accused him of aesthetic disruption for letting his sunflowers lean toward the sidewalk. Another claimed his scarecrow violated the community's dress code policy. The best one, though, said that visible hay bales might inspire vermin behavior. Joe didn't even know what that meant, but he chuckled as he tossed the stack into his wood stove. He wasn't about to be intimidated by a group of people who got winded walking across their artificial turf. Still, he knew it wouldn't stop. Karanet had made him a target, and if he wasn't careful, the next letter would be backed by a city citation. She wasn't just annoying anymore. She was escalating. That became even clearer on Wednesday morning, when Joe stepped outside and noticed something strange near his waterline. The grass was wet in patches, but the pattern didn't make sense. He followed it back to the small irrigation pipe that fed water to the eastern edge of his crop field. The cap had been tampered with, clean cut, the kind that didn't happen by accident. He crouched down and confirmed it. The pipe had been severed and reattached hastily. When he turned the valve, nothing came out. He walked to the pump house, checked the main system, and that's when he saw the new lock. Bright, silver, and unfamiliar. Hanging from the spigot like a middle finger. Joe didn't need to guess. He knew. The HOA had sent someone. Maybe not officially, but someone under their direction had walked onto his land, cut into his irrigation, and installed a lock to control his water. He stared at it for a long moment, the muscles in his jaw working quietly. He reached for his bolt cutters, but then paused. No. Not yet. He'd seen what happened when emotions made decisions. This needed documentation. He went back to the house, grabbed his trail cam backups, and swapped out the memory cards. He had set the cameras up a while ago for coyotes, but now he realized they'd caught more than four-legged trespassers. Later that afternoon, Joe sat in his workshop going through the footage. Sure enough, there they were. 3 people, just after midnight, walking along the fence line in HOA polos like they were on some kind of covert operation. They carried flashlights, tools, and what looked like a contractor's clipboard. One of them clipped the pipe. Another placed the lock. The last one posed for a photo. Joe leaned back in his chair, amazed at the arrogance. Not only had they trespassed, but they'd documented it like it was a victory. He smiled. Then he backed up the footage to 3 separate drives and emailed it to a friend, an agriculture compliance officer who owed him a favor. Meanwhile, across the street, Karenette was hosting an impromptu HOA strategy meeting in her driveway, complete with folding chairs, lemonade, and a hand-drawn poster that read "Keep Our Neighborhood Clean." Joe could hear the laughter from his porch. One of the men said loud enough for the whole block to hear, "Next we should fine him for the wind blowing his weeds into my yard." Karenette added, "And those chickens? I swear they have it out for me. They pecked at my Prius last week." Joe sipped his tea and said nothing, but he reached down and fed another piece of wood into the fire pit beside him. Patience, he told himself. Let them dig their own hole. That night, something unexpected happened. A white truck pulled into his driveway, and out stepped someone he hadn't seen in years. Carl Evans, his old buddy from the service, now a USDA field inspector. Carl took one look at the irrigation lock and let out a low whistle. "They're lucky you're calm, Joe. This alone is a felony if it touches your food crop." Joe nodded. "That's why I called you." Carl examined the whole property, documenting everything, even the sarcastic sign someone had stuck to the fence that read "No dirt allowed." After an hour, Carl said he'd be filing a report with the county and the state. Joe offered him a dozen eggs and a jar of pickles for the road. Carl laughed and said, "Just like old times." By the end of the week, the crops on the east side had started to wither from lack of water. Joe rotated what he could and adjusted the rest, but the damage was visible. Karenette took full advantage of this, hosting another walkthrough with HOA members. They stopped right at the edge of his field, pointing and murmuring things like, "See, this is what happens when you mix farming with real estate and someone needs to step in before the weeds reach the clubhouse." Joe watched from a distance as one of them even pretended to gag at the smell of fertilizer. What none of them noticed was the local reporter standing just down the road, camera in hand. Word had gotten around about the pipe footage. The reporter had reached out to Joe for a quote, but he declined, saying he preferred to let the facts speak for themselves. So she came to see for herself. She filmed the HOA walkthrough, the dying crops, and even managed to snag a few soundbites from Karenette, who boasted, "We're taking back our community, one goat at a time." It was the kind of sentence that didn't age well, especially when paired with nighttime footage of her personally snapping pictures of a locked water valve on someone else's land. 2 days later, the footage aired on the local news. The title was subtle, "Farmers Under Fire from HOA?" But the content was explosive. The video ran side-by-side clips of Karenette's statements, nighttime surveillance, and commentary from Carl about the agricultural violations. The public reaction was immediate. Viewers flooded the station with outrage. The HOA's email inbox was hit with hundreds of complaints, and one local barbecue joint even offered Joe free meals for a year. Karenette tried to spin it, calling the footage out of context, but the damage was done. Her smug confidence started to crack. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. Joe wasn't invited, but he didn't need to be. He already knew what was coming. Still, she wouldn't back down. A new notice arrived at Joe's door, this time with a larger fine and a bold declaration that the entire property would be reviewed for unlicensed environmental activity. Joe read it, then walked back to the barn. He passed the goats, the chickens, and the rows of withering crops. He wasn't angry. He was ready. That night, he opened the old barn doors fully for the first time in years. Beneath a dusty tarp rested something few people in the county had ever seen outside a museum. Steel-plated, battle-worn. A vehicle he kept for ceremonial parades and military reenactments, but fully operational within the limits of private ownership. As he pulled back the tarp, the moonlight glinted off its surface. The name painted across the front still shone through, Iron Justice. Joe wiped the dust from its side and leaned on it, the way one might lean on an old friend. "Let them come," he whispered. "I'll be waiting." And with that, the quiet farmer began preparing not just for a response, but for a reckoning. The clouds rolled in heavy that morning, matching the mood hanging over the neighborhood like a slow-moving storm. Joe stood by the edge of his field, arms crossed as he watched two unfamiliar utility trucks roll up beside the main road. Out stepped three men in reflective vests and hard hats, the kind of folks sent to fix leaks or mark gas lines. But they weren't from the city. Joe could tell right away. Their badges were HOA issued, laminated, and laughable. One of them held a clipboard with highlighted notes, squinting at the map like he didn't know north from west. Joe didn't move. He just observed silently as they approached the irrigation trench near his front gate. One of the men pulled out a small orange flag and stabbed it into the soil. Another started unspooling caution tape. They hadn't said a word to Joe, hadn't knocked on his door or announced their purpose. It was like they thought his land was theirs. After a few more flags and some crude measurements, one finally noticed him. He cleared his throat and offered a half-hearted wave. Joe didn't wave back. Instead, he took a slow step forward and said plainly, "You're trespassing." The man looked down at his clipboard and muttered something about an emergency drainage assessment. Joe tilted his head. "Funny," he said. "This land isn't even in your HOA jurisdiction. Never has been. Unless you'd like to see a copy of the 1954 zoning plat?" The workers exchanged awkward glances. One of them mumbled, "We're just following orders." Joe didn't respond. He simply raised his phone, snapped a photo, and turned around. That was all he needed. By the afternoon, the trench area was roped off, and the so-called assessment had resulted in them digging a 2-foot-wide channel right through the corner of Joe's vegetable garden. Lettuce uprooted, carrots sliced through, and part of the compost heap left exposed like an open wound. Joe stood at the edge of the destruction and said nothing. He wasn't the type to shout or flail his arms. Instead, he walked into his house, opened a manila folder labeled Emergency Protocols, and made a call to a lawyer he hadn't spoken to in years. Then he called Carl, who answered immediately and, upon hearing the details, responded with a slow whistle and a promise. "Oh, it's on now." What the HOA didn't know was that their careless operation had just crossed a legal line so thick it might as well have been painted in neon. The trench they dug had violated not only property boundaries but had also cut into a protected zone registered under a state Veteran Land Preservation Act. Joe had filed the documents himself years ago, mostly to keep development away. Now that same protection was about to become his sword. While Karenette sat comfortably at home likely bragging about how she'd finally disrupted Joe's mud empire, Joe was laying the groundwork for something she couldn't bulldoze with policy. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Joe set up new trail cams. But this time, they weren't just for evidence. He wired them through a local cloud-based surveillance feed, tied in with motion alert. If anyone stepped foot on his land again without permission, he'd get a ping on his phone within seconds. And this time, he wasn't just documenting it, he was broadcasting it. His niece, a web developer in Austin, had helped him set up a small livestream page labeled "Watch Karenette's Crew Try to Steal My Dirt." Within a day, it had over 5,000 subscribers. People weren't just watching, they were waiting. Things escalated 2 days later when Joe woke up to find a brand new citation taped to his barn door. It wasn't from the city or the county. It was a printed HOA document claiming he owed over $600 in penalties for illegal water distribution and unauthorized earth disruption. Joe almost laughed. The nerve of it! They dug into his land, cut his pipe, and now they were accusing him of the crime. But it wasn't funny. Not when it was in black and white, signed by Karanet herself. The timing was clear. She was trying to get the upper hand before his complaints reached the right officials. Joe didn't waste time. He emailed the local newspaper with a full statement, attached drone photos of the trench, timestamps, footage of the workers, and a link to the archived HOA meeting where Karanet had declared, on record, "If we have to dig it ourselves, we will." That soundbite would be the match that lit the fire. By evening, the story was everywhere. Local news anchors interviewed Joe live on his porch. Bloggers and influencers picked up the livestream and shared it with hashtags like #FarmWarrior and #DirtJustice. One post went viral, a split screen showing Karanet sipping wine at an HOA mixer next to Joe standing stoic in front of a trench and a mangled crop row. Karanet, who had grown used to wielding the rules like a sword, finally began to feel the blade twist. Residents started attending HOA meetings just to glare at her. One elderly couple openly accused her of ruining the neighborhood's reputation. A petition to recall the board circulated with record speed. She called a press conference, trying to paint Joe as unstable and aggressive, but it collapsed instantly when the footage of her private security yelling at Joe's chickens was played on air. The turning point came that Friday morning. Joe was watering the remaining crops when a black SUV pulled into his drive. Out stepped a sharply dressed man with a government badge. His name was Ramirez. He introduced himself as a regional compliance officer investigating HOA misconduct across the state. He'd seen the news, but what really triggered the visit was the footage Joe's niece had compiled into a legal brief. Ramirez explained that their department had opened a formal investigation and that several HOA members, including Karanet, were now under review for abuse of power and falsifying violation notices. Joe offered the man a seat and some fresh lemonade, and they spoke for nearly an hour. Before Ramirez left, he said something that stuck. "Most folks in your position would have lost their temper. You didn't. You built your case with patience. That's rare." Joe smiled and replied, "You don't put out a fire with gasoline. You use a hose or you wait for the wind to change." That afternoon, Joe stood inside the barn again. He'd taken the tank out once for maintenance. Now it was fully prepped. Tires checked. Systems flushed. Engine cleaned. It wasn't armed, it didn't need to be. It was legal, restored, and intimidating as hell. He'd kept it for years as a relic, a memory from a life few people knew he had lived. But now it had a purpose again. He wasn't going to use it to scare. He was going to use it to teach. Not through threats, but through power presented calmly and unmistakably. He attached a wooden placard to the tank's front bumper, freshly painted by hand. It read, "Respect the dirt. Or meet the steel." Joe stood back, admiring the message. There were no horns blaring, no speeches made, just a quiet moment between man and machine. The same machine that had once rumbled across foreign lands now sat ready in a quiet American town. It wouldn't fire a single shot. It didn't need to, because when it rolled through those HOA gates, it would carry with it the weight of every overlooked voice, every fined inch of lawn, every mocked chicken and goat. And for the first time, they'd listen. Because steel speaks louder than rules. Sunday morning dawned bright and warm, the kind of perfect suburban day that HOA newsletters loved to boast about. Birds chirped politely, sprinklers hissed across well-trimmed lawns, and the HOA board had gathered on the cul-de-sac green for their weekly community enrichment brunch. Karanet stood at the center, flanked by two other board members, beaming under her sun hat like she hadn't just been the focus of a county-level investigation. The tables were set with white cloths and tiny name placards, and someone had even brought mini quiches and sparkling cider. As neighbors mingled in forced smiles and passive-aggressive side comments, the mood was smugly celebratory. Karanet had decided to play offense, framing Joe as a delusional farmer who was stirring up drama and threatening their modern lifestyle with military relics and internet pity parties. Her plan was to control the narrative by making his silence look like weakness. And then the rumble began. At first, it was subtle, almost like distant thunder. A low, deep vibration that rolled through the neighborhood in slow, deliberate pulses. Glasses trembled on brunch tables. The wind shifted. Dogs barked wildly from behind fences. Someone's mimosa spilled. Heads turned. Chairs scraped back. Then came the sound no one expected in a quiet neighborhood, the metallic grind of steel treads rolling over pavement. Not tires. Not a truck. Treads. Heavy. Purposeful. Relentless. From the tree-lined curve at the end of the block, it appeared. An M60 Patton tank, fully restored and glinting in the morning sun, turned the corner at a slow crawl. It was massive, painted in matte olive with fresh polish, not menacing but undeniably powerful. The machine dwarfed everything around it. Cars, fences, mailboxes, nothing looked the same once the tank rolled into view. And seated calmly in the open hatch, hat tilted low, was Joe. Sunglasses on. Elbow resting casually on the rim. No expression of rage. No sign of gloating. Just the silent presence of someone who had finally decided to make himself impossible to ignore. The neighborhood froze. Brunch halted. Cider bottles dropped. Karanet stood mid-sentence, mouth open, watching as the tank rolled up to the very center of the gathering, stopping neatly across 4 of the HOA board's reserved parking spaces. Not 1 inch more. Not 1 inch less. The engine idled, deep and confident, as Joe climbed down slowly, dusted off his hands, and adjusted the wooden placard tied to the front. Respect the dirt. Or meet the steel. He walked across the stunned lawn and picked up one of the name placards from the brunch table, Karenet's, and used it to steady a pitcher that had nearly fallen. Then he looked around and spoke. I figured since I was such a threat to community values, I'd show up properly. No one laughed. No one moved. He continued, voice calm but sharp. You tried to cut off my water. You dug a trench through my crops. You threatened my animals, my home, and my livelihood. You faked citations. You trespassed. And still I said nothing. I gave you eggs. I gave you warnings. You gave me fines and headlines. A nervous chuckle escaped someone near the back. Karanet tried to speak, but Joe held up one finger. I'm not here to argue. I'm here to inform. This tank is legal. My land is legally protected. And as of this morning, I've filed a full federal claim against this HOA for property damage, agricultural sabotage, and harassment under Veteran Protection Statute. My lawyer has all your names. And that trench you dug? It cut into a registered soil conservation project that just got state funding. You messed up paperwork. I've got video. I've got witnesses. I've got public support. What V you got? Folded napkins and brunch gossip. Karanet turned red. Her lips twitched, but her voice failed her. One of the board members tried to step forward, blurting out something about HOA rights and noise ordinances, but Joe turned toward him with a slow, deliberate glance and said, Go ahead. Try to ticket a federally documented parade vehicle. I'll even let the state troopers explain it to you. They're on their way. The board member stepped back. People were filming now. Phones out. Kids giggling. Teenagers high-fiving behind their parent. A few residents who had never said a word before gave Joe a quiet thumbs up. Others simply stood with mouths open, processing what they were witnessing. It wasn't just a spectacle, it was a reversal of power. The underdog had not only endured the mockery but responded with a move so calculated, so unforgettable, that the HOA had no play left. Joe walked back to the tank and leaned against the side, arms crossed. The tank rumbled beneath him, alive and unbothered. He didn't need to threaten. The steel spoke for him. Karanet finally found her voice, pointing a shaking finger and snapping, This is intimidation. You're trying to scare people. You've crossed the line. Joe raised an eyebrow. You crossed it first. Before anyone could respond, sirens echoed in the distance. 2 sheriff vehicles and 1 state agriculture inspection truck turned into the cul-de-sac. Officers stepped out with calm professionalism. They didn't look at Joe. They walked directly to Karanet and asked her to come with them for a formal statement regarding several complaints. Her face drained of color. She tried to protest, but the lead officer held up a printed stack of documents. The surveillance footage, legal filings, and a letter from the USDA confirming active investigations. Joe didn't move. He just watched her walk away, escorted like a tourist leaving a restricted site. One of the officers passed by him and nodded. "Nice paint job. My dad served in one of these." Joe gave a quiet nod back. "Mine too." By the time the sun began to set, the tank was parked neatly at the edge of Joe's property, just outside the line that marked where the HOA's jurisdiction ended. He set up a small table beside it with a crate of free vegetables and a new sign that read, "For the neighborhood. No fine required." Kids came by. Neighbors came by. Even the ones who used to look down at him now approached with cautious gratitude. Joe didn't gloat. He handed out squash, tomatoes, and cucumbers like always. But the tank was still there, a silent reminder that even the quietest man has a breaking point and a plan. Across the street, the clubhouse sat empty. The brunch tables had been cleared. The name placards were gone. The HOA website had been taken offline. Joe sat on his porch, boots up, glass of lemonade in hand. The goats grazed calmly beside the fence. The chickens clucked with unbothered rhythm. And just beyond the gate, a piece of history rested like a sleeping giant. Joe didn't want a fight. He never had. But sometimes, when the people who make the rules forget their purpose, you don't need to shout. You just roll in quietly, let the ground shake beneath their feet, and remind them that respect isn't given by title. It's earned with grit. By Monday morning, the tank had become the most famous object in town. Photos of it parked beside Joe's field were plastered across news articles, social media posts, and even a few meme pages with captions like, "When HOA finds hit $1000, so you bring backup." But while the internet laughed and the town buzzed, Joe remained as steady as ever. He spent his morning harvesting cucumbers, feeding the animals, and double-checking the tank's security just in case someone got any ideas. He had no interest in being a spectacle, and certainly not in starting a war. He had made his point. Now it was time for the dust to settle. But as always, the HOA didn't know when to quit. A new notice appeared at his mailbox that afternoon, this one printed in red and full of bluster. It claimed that Joe's military display violated local visual harmony guidelines and posed a psychological threat to community wellness. Joe laughed quietly as he read it, folded the letter neatly, and added it to a growing stack in a folder marked nonsense. He wasn't worried. Not now. Not with everything already in motion. His lawyer had confirmed the tank was fully compliant, registered as a ceremonial vehicle, and protected under several federal exemptions due to his veteran status and the nature of his land. What the HOA was calling a display was, legally speaking, no different than a tractor with some flair. The investigation into Karanet and the HOA board had picked up speed. Witnesses had come forward, including one of the trench workers who admitted they were told the land was already HOA-owned. He'd seen the original zoning map now, and he was furious about being misled. Another board member resigned quietly, leaving a statement with the local paper saying he'd been pressured to vote in favor of actions he now regretted. The city council, tired of the noise and flooded with angry residents, had called a special session to review HOA authority boundaries. Joe didn't attend, but he received a personal letter from the mayor's office thanking him for remaining calm and contributing to a broader conversation about overreach. Joe shook his head when he read it. All he'd ever wanted was to be left alone. Karanet, however, had no plans of going quietly. From what Joe heard, she'd begun making unhinged statements online, calling herself the victim of a smear campaign and insisting Joe was a danger to the neighborhood. She claimed he was stockpiling weapons and training animals to attack people. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so pitiful. Joe knew the more she ranted, the more she revealed. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth was already moving faster than her lies. One evening, as the sky turned golden and the fields glowed with the last light of the day, a knock came at Joe's door. It was Ramirez again, the state compliance officer, with a smile on his face and a briefcase in his hand. He stepped inside and handed Joe a packet of finalized documents. The investigation was complete. The report confirmed multiple violations by the HOA, including unlawful trespassing, property damage, and abuse of administrative authority. Caronet had been removed from her position by a vote of the remaining board members, under pressure from the council and legal threats. The HOA was placed under temporary oversight by an independent administrator until a full review could be conducted. Joe thanked him, offered coffee, and they sat on the porch for a while in comfortable silence. Ramirez eventually said, "You changed more than just a neighborhood here. People are looking into other HOAs now. Your case started something." Joe looked out over his land and replied, "I didn't set out to change the world. Just wanted to keep my soil from being stolen." Ramirez nodded and finished his coffee. Before leaving, he glanced at the tank and asked, "Are you keeping it out front?" Joe smiled. "Only until the message finishes sinking in." As the week passed, things began to return to a strange kind of normal. The tension had dissolved, and the neighbors, many of whom had once looked down on Joe, were now waving, stopping to chat, even offering help with the harvest. One kid from down the street asked if he could sit in the tank. Joe let him climb in, under supervision, and the kid's joy was worth every ounce of stress the machine had caused. Others dropped off thank you notes, pies, even handmade signs of support. Joe built a small stand at the edge of his property where people could take vegetables and eggs for free. Beside it, he placed a sign that read, "No fines. Just food." One afternoon, as he was repairing a section of the fence, a familiar face walked up the drive. It was the elderly couple from 2 doors down, the ones who had always looked uncomfortable around him. The husband held out a folded paper. It was a hand-drawn map, showing their property line and a note offering to donate part of their unused yard for a community garden. Joe was surprised. The man looked embarrassed and said, "Figured maybe we start acting like neighbors instead of landlords." Joe smiled and accepted. It wasn't about land. It was about decency. By the time summer reached its peak, the tank had become a local landmark. Families brought visiting relatives to see it. Schools asked if Joe would speak about history and community right. A muralist from the city painted the tank's side with peaceful farm scenes and the phrase, "Stand your ground with grace." Joe considered moving it back to the barn, but every time he mentioned it, someone would say, "Leave it. It reminds us what matters." Caronet eventually moved out. Her house was sold to a young couple who converted the yard into a wildlife-friendly garden. The HOA was redesigned with new leadership, stripped of its overreaching rules, and given a public oversight committee. Joe didn't join it. He didn't want power. He just wanted his farm, his animals, and his peace. But his story remained. Not as a legend of revenge, but as proof that you didn't need to shout or destroy to win. Sometimes you just needed to stand still while the storm raged, and let truth do the shaking. On the final night of summer, Joe sat on his porch, lemonade in one hand and a warm breeze brushing through the field. The animals were quiet. The tank sat still, lit by soft string lights and a little flag waving from the hatch. A few kids rode their bikes by and waved. Joe waved back. He looked out over the land, his land, and felt a calm pride settle over him. Not the pride of victory. The pride of survival. He hadn't picked this fight. But he'd ended it. Not with anger, not with noise. But with dignity, patience, and when pushed too far, with the loudest silence of all, steel rolling up to brunch on a Sunday morning. And from that day forward, nobody ever tried to find a sunflower again.